All right, so good afternoon, good morning, whenever you're listening to this podcast video. My name is Angie and I'm one of the co-founders of EWE. So welcome to our first podcast conversation with a very special guest. But we wanted to just kick off sharing a little bit about our mission so you can connect with us if our mission is something that would be of value to you. So EWE is an organization. It was founded by entrepreneur women for entrepreneur women. We are providing educational tools, resources, and overall an environment that is conducive to uplifting, cheering each other on. Entrepreneur woman is always, it comes with extra challenges. So we definitely wanted to create a place where we all could lean on each other, learn from each other, and grow together. So that's what this is. We meet monthly. We're currently meeting via virtual WebEx meetings on a monthly basis, the third Tuesday of every month, and you will have the meeting information right on the screen there. And then we have this podcast that we're so excited about because monthly meetings are meant to really bring more of the nuts and bolts, as Michelle will put it, of everything that you need to be a successful entrepreneur. So the podcast is a complement to that, and it's meant to help the emotional aspect of being an entrepreneur woman. So we hope you enjoy, and without further ado, we're going to jump right into our topic. Today's conversation is all about self-care. And I think that it couldn't be any more perfect time to discuss this. I'm going to introduce myself and I'll have you meet the team. My name is Angie Perez. I'm co-founder of Paradigm IT Group and also co-founder of this amazing group. And I'm going to pass it on to Aisa.
Good morning, my name is Aisa. I am the owner of Your Brand Designs, and I'm also one of the co-founders of EWE. And Michelle.
Thank you, Aisa. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. My name is Michelle Moss. I'm also one of the co-founders of EWE, and I'm the owner and founding partner and managing member of Johnson Moss, which is my law firm.
We have a very, very special guest. We're going to give her some time to introduce herself, but Liz DiTomasso is a certified life coach with an amazing story. So Liz, I'm going to actually have you share a little bit about your background, your story, and what your mission is today. So take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a privilege to speak to all three of you and your audience today. I actually started as an attorney, and I knew pretty early on in law school that being a lawyer probably wasn't the path I was going to follow after law school, but I had already invested the time and the money. So I continued through with it and did actually become a lawyer for a short time after law school. My real passion was fitness, which I had started while in law school. And when I lost my job as an attorney, I immediately turned in that direction and have held several different roles in the fitness industry, from management to training to teaching group exercise classes. The life coaching path really has been built on every experience and fundamentally who I am in life. From the time I was a young child, my family and friends always relied on me as their rock to listen with an empathetic ear and to give them objective advice. So I feel like all of my life experiences in my career have sort of woven together this base of skills that have helped me in forming my life coaching business. And I finally did that officially last year when I got the courage to take that jump and put myself out there as a life coach.
Well, we're super excited to have you today and kind of help us really talk about such an important topic, right? So I pulled up a couple of definitions as it relates to self-care. And one of the ones that I liked the most was self-care, right? In definition is the practice of taking an active role in protecting one's well-being, happiness, and in particular during periods of stress. So the part that stood out to me there was taking an active role. There's been an awareness as it relates to self-care, but I think especially as women, sometimes we have a hard time embracing it because we almost feel guilty about it. So I don't know how that resonates with Aisa and Michelle. And Liz, if you want to, kind of talk to us a little bit more about some of the circumstances that, where sometimes people come to you and you see that there's a need for focus in that area.
I think in general, there is a lot of guilt because as women, particularly in this day and age, women are expected to work sometimes full time, and they're expected to hold down the household full time and do it perfectly and do it all really, really, really well, which we know is impossible, right? Because that's essentially 2 full-time jobs. So I think a lot of the guilt just comes from what our culture expects of women in general, right? Because it's not really men that necessarily struggle with the ability to put their needs first or take care of themselves. It tends to be women. And so when people come to me with this sense that they're just feeling stuck or lost, typically it's because they haven't put their needs first. And sometimes they don't even know what their needs are because they have been delegating all of their attention and energy to serving their families, to serving their friends. And so I help them first come to a point where we figure out what are your needs as an individual? What are your values as an individual? And I love the definition of self-care that you gave. I look at self-care as being really about 4 different categories of life. It's about your physical body. It's about your mental health, your emotional health, and your spiritual health. And I've even seen some people put social as a category as well, which talks a lot about boundaries, relationships that are nurturing, even what you look at with social media content that either feeds into self-care or sometimes it can be a bit destructive. So yeah, I think that women in general do have a hard time with this concept because we have been taught that it's selfish and that it is better to look after other people's needs. But as we all know, and anyone listening to this knows, at some point you have to put your needs first. If you stopped eating, you'd have issues physically. The other needs in the other categories are just as important as food is to your physical body.
That's interesting because I think it's interesting. You're right. There's different areas to self-care. Aisa, Michelle, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I totally agree with both Liz and Angie. And I think what Liz said in the beginning, a lot of times we are dependent on as well to be like that ear or that shoulder to cry on, and we see that as being somebody strong for somebody else, but we also forget that sometimes that energy, if we're not strong in how we self-care, that energy also goes ahead and brings in some other energy. And if we don't know how to control it and don't give ourselves that time to self-care, it actually gets overwhelming in your personal. And like Liz said, I mean, there's a lot of things that you have going on as a female, especially if you're being a mom. It's not only about just being a person to take care of an individual. I mean, there's so many other hats and category under that mom title. Being a wife is the same way. So when you add all of these categories or all of these hats that you're wearing, you need to make sure that your self-care is something very strong. You have a really good base to it, because if not, it can get overwhelming. And that's when you start going into different places that you don't want to be in. That's something very important. It's important. That's when to take your schedule and make sure that your self-care, even if it's 15 minutes a day for yourself, just to take a breather, it's very important to go ahead and do that.
Yeah. I was just going to say that I agree that, you really need to take that time, and it may not necessarily look like, okay, I just need, me time to be by myself. To me, my me time is if I'm riding my bike or if I'm working out on the elliptical, it's just any time that I have to be kind of by myself and focus on a task, and there's not anyone else that I'm kind of responsible for at least 15 or 20 minutes. And it could be, just riding in the car, listening to an audiobook, but just taking advantage of what I'd like to call the time in between to kind of just relax. And, because it's real easy to just keep on going and over all your to-do lists in your head and, everything else, and just really being present in each moment. So I think for women, especially, learning to take advantage of those times, the time in between, the waiting time, the times when you actually are by yourself, I think is critical parts of self-care.
So Liz, I wanted to kind of jump in. So starting to kind of peel away the layers, right? Let's talk about the mindset, because that is, I think, when we keep talking about self-care, and it's this wonderful, thing that we should all practice. But let's talk about the mindset and the guilt. How do you overcome? What are some tips or some ways that you can help overcome that guilt factor?
I think one of the things is to understand that we all have a relationship with ourselves. I think we tend, especially as women, again, to look at our lives and say, I have these people that are responsible for me and these other relationships that need tending to. And we forget that we actually have a relationship with ourselves. And that's the foundation for every other relationship in our life. So I think if we can first shift our perspective and see that the relationship with ourselves needs tending first, and that ends up benefiting every other relationship in our life, it helps to start to peel away some of the guilt that's there. I'm also a big advocate for whatever feelings you have that are coming up, addressing them in whatever way works best for you. So I know I'm definitely the type of person that guilt, especially, and I know guilt is a big one for women, I tend to just kind of ignore it or push past it or do something else. That doesn't serve us either. So really acknowledging that the guilt is there. And for me, I might literally say out loud, because I live alone, I feel you, guilt. I know that you're there. I know that you're trying to get my attention for a reason. So acknowledging the emotion and then taking a step to process it, because emotions are actually the feeling of the body. So I have several techniques that I use to process my emotions and essentially make sure that they know they've been acknowledged. I've been able to work through them. And once you can work through the actual emotion, then you shift your perspective into what I was talking about with a relationship with yourself. And I'm happy to share any other resources and things that I do to process my emotions. I think that's a big one for women too, who aren't used to acknowledging emotions, accepting them, feeling them. This is a huge first step. It's really a big one, because it'll hold us back if we don't in various ways.
Thank you so much. I think one thing that I had to write down as you were speaking, the biggest thing that stood out for me is the relationship with yourself. Wow. Like, it's something so simple, but I don't think I think about it. We really don't. We think about having relationships with everyone else, and we put so much effort, time, and energy in giving the best of us to try to serve and support in one way or another. And I think that we forget, you're so right, that the main relationship needs to be with ourselves. And I think one of the other things that I just thought about, I wanted to share, is we don't have to wait to become adults to learn these things, right? I think we need to make sure that we're learning, implementing into our lives, but then also teaching on to the next generation. I had a situation with my teenager just recently, and we were having a conversation yesterday, and it kind of came to me, and I said, listen, I need you to take this time every week, figure out how you want to slice and dice it, but I need you to, take time for yourself. As moms and just as leaders, even with our businesses and the people that we work with, we need to make sure that as much as we want to build relationships, if that self-relationship, that personal relationship is not there, and if we're not encouraging that, then we're not setting ourselves up for success.
I agree with you. That's really good that you're doing that with your daughter, Angie, because I kind of feel like sometimes, when we become adults, we have already seen our moms doing the same things. So in our mind, we're thinking, okay, we have to be able to balance all of this. Me personally, I had a mom that she started working in the fields, and while she was working in the fields, she also worked a part-time at another location. Plus she had 2 kids and she was pregnant, and she always used to be working until she was almost due. Then eventually she had 4 kids and she became a teacher, but during the summer she had a part-time. So I saw her like balancing, all of our sports, our school, everything. So to me, in my mind, I said, okay, I want to be a superhero just like my mom, you know? So sometimes we go ahead and we take ourselves and we put ourselves and say, we have to be able to do this. Mom did it. Why can't I do it? So we forget about taking time for ourselves and actually focusing that, yes, we can go ahead and do it, but it comes me first. Recently, what I did is that, being a full-time entrepreneur now, I kind of felt like I was losing myself in my schedule because I wasn't using the word no, and no is a full sentence. Like, so what I did is I created myself like a framework. And one of the things that I noticed, I love my kids, I love my nieces and nephew, but there was no me time anywhere. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to start by creating myself a framework. I want to go ahead and put everything in priority. But this time I'm going to switch it up a little bit, and I'm going to even put a picture of myself as my screensaver. So I can remind myself that, hey, there's somebody, you need to think about yourself before you answer that phone call or before you say yes to something else, just because you want to help somebody else or you want to be able to make sure that person is happy.
Chime in a little bit there. I think also to what you call like the face you put on it. Some people aren't comfortable with me time, or maybe that, well, Liz knows for attorneys, that might be seen as you're being weak or something like that. And I was also in the military, so they'd be like, suck it up, whatever, keep going, you can work through anything, and, that type of thing. And I think it's not really, you can call it, and anxiety or stress relief. What you're really trying to do is just kind of decompress. And, you can't, whether you call it self-care, whether you call it stress relief, whether you call it, trying to keep my sanity, whatever it is that you call it, that you do have to take some time, because especially I think in our profession, well, your former profession, but attorneys, we have a really high suicide rate. We have a high rate of substance abuse. And a lot of that is because they either, they hate what they do, or they hate who they have to be when they do what they do. They don't like what they're doing. So, I mean, and I happen to love trial work, but I mean, it is a little stressful. So I have to, when I come home, like you can ask my husband, I don't want to make any decisions. Like I spend all day, doing this with other people in other cases all day long. So when I come home, I don't want to have conflict. I don't want to make a bunch of decisions. And, he just has to they have to understand that I do this all day. So when I come home, I just want to have everything decided for me. And you don't have to get my input or, whatever. But I think some people may have some of the guilt that comes is, sometimes if you just put a different name on it, okay, it's not self-care, it's stress relief, it's, take a break, collect your thoughts. For me, I think it's critical to understand when you need to take that break. And for me, it's like, I have a 5-year-old, so he teaches me a lot of good things, but a lot of it is patience, because, the first no, he just keeps coming, he just keeps asking again, he just keeps coming. So I'm like, well, that's good for sales, but it's bad for, when you're trying to learn how to say no. Like no means no. But you do have to learn how to do that. You do have to learn how to say no and shut some things down, but just to preserve yourself.
Let's keep kind of talking through this, right? So we kind of make our way to being in the mindset and giving it a name that makes us feel like guilt is not part of the equation. So where do we start, Liz? Where does someone that has no understanding, has never, really thought of carving out time or where does that person start?
I think one of the basic things you can start with is having an understanding of which of the categories of self-care feel like they're the most diminished, or maybe you didn't even necessarily think about them for your life before. So out of the physical, out of the mental, out of the emotional, out of the spiritual, and again, some people consider social to be a category, which of those intuitively feels like they need my attention first? And the key thing, which I heard sort of echoed as a theme here, is find something or a name that works for you as an individual. I know for myself, for example, I tend to not see my progress in life. It's very easy for me to overlook where I've come a long way in certain areas of my life. And that sometimes keeps me stuck then in feeling really good about moving forward in an area of life. So I have something called a victory journal at night. It's a really small journal because I know for myself, if it was the kind of journal where I have to write for an extensive period of time, I'm not going to be committed to it. But because it's tiny, I sort of tricked myself in my own psyche in realizing Liz, it'll take you 1 minute to fill out a page of whatever your victories for the day were. So my victories, I count the small things as well as the big things. My victories might be being on a podcast. My victories might be I put a post out. I said I would put a post out and I actually followed through on my word to myself. So I think the key thing there is knowing which area needs your attention the most and then finding what is going to work for you, whether it's the time frame, whether it's the activity, something that actually makes you excited to do for yourself. A key thing I definitely wanted to tag in on too is something Michelle said that is just brilliant. She knows what her needs are and she communicated her needs, right? She talked about knowing she didn't want to make decisions when she goes home and her family knows that, right? So that's a really good place to start too. What are my basic needs? Some women probably don't even know what their basic needs are, right? What are my needs as an individual? And am I willing to find a way to communicate those needs to the people around me that can help me uphold those needs and make sure that we create an environment where I can get those needs met for myself?
Wow. Aisa, Michelle, any thoughts, anything else along those lines that you wanted to chime in with?
I would say, Liz, if you have any tips for people who, may think that, hey, I'm doing just fine, or things are great. I remember when I stopped working at the firm, how all of my families and friends were like, oh God, you're so much better now. You were so stressed out before, but they didn't say anything. They never said anything. You're always looking at your phone and all. I'm like, why didn't anybody say something? But clearly I felt like, okay, I'm doing everything fine. But clearly they saw a difference from when I, was working at the firm to when I stopped, how much that changed as far as just my, I guess, the energy that I was putting out. So do you have any, tips for people on either how they can figure out that they may be stressed out or they may need to take some time for self-care?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the basic ways that I meet with people who are in this situation is they start to feel like they're stuck in some way in their life, or their life isn't quite as happy or beautiful as they thought that it would be. And the situation you were describing, that doesn't sound like that was necessarily your own mentality when you were in that stage of life. You sort of just, continued in it. And, I get that sometimes we won't see it until we're outside of it. I think one really practical way that women might help themselves to see whether their current life is in alignment with what they really want for themselves and their best version of themselves or not, is to do this exercise called a values compass. And there's lots of different ways that you can do this. You can Google values compass or find your values and probably find a lot of different exercises. But the key here is to figure out, for me right now where I am in my life, what are my key values? There's my life coaching coach who actually taught me. She has a book called Brilliance. Her name is Amy Lombardo, and she actually has an exercise in her book in chapter 3 called Values Compass, and she walks readers through how to figure out what their values are. Again, you can probably Google values and find a way to do this, but I think once you know what your values are for who you are right now in your life, it's a good starting point for asking yourself, okay, so these are my values. Does my current life kind of align with that? Does it feel like there's some areas that don't quite feel like I'm living my values out? It might help with some of that, just some of the ways in which we deny how we actually feel right now in the moment, or ways in which we can't really see what other people can see from the outside.
Thank you, Liz. And I think everything that you're saying just brings me back. The definition that we read off at the beginning, right, of the conversation was take the practice of taking an active role. So I think the first thing that we have to do as women, as just women that want to do more and keep growing and being the best version of ourselves, is make a decision to take an active role, because nothing, everything that we do takes a lot of effort and energy. So what better way to invest effort and energy than into ourselves? Liz, I have a question for you. Let's say that you have these moments where you're like, maybe I need to take some time and think about this or give this some time, but let's say you don't, right? And we just kind of keep going through life and going through the motions. What would you say are some negative ways that not stopping to have that conversation with ourselves? What are some of the negative ways that can reflect in our, not just today, but overall in our lifetime?
It reflects, it reflects in a few different ways. I'd say one really obvious one is physically. Sometimes, we might end up gaining weight. We might end up getting some sort of illness that springs from our lifestyle choices. So that's a really obvious way that I think a lot of Americans, both men and women, are impacted from not stopping and attending to self-care every day as it relates to physical, mental, and emotional health. Some of the other ways I would say I think people tend to have this sort of crisis, and I think traditionally it was called midlife crisis, but it seems like some of the younger generations are having the crisis earlier, where they just don't feel fulfilled. On the inside, they feel like there's a void or there's something missing in their lives. So if we haven't really attended to our self-care in the different areas, I think we start to get that feeling in life where something feels like it's missing. We just don't feel as happy as we thought life would be when we were younger and envisioning this beautiful future for ourselves. Some of the other ways I've seen it manifest too is people staying in jobs or relationships that weren't the best fit for them, that weren't nurturing, and they accept that for themselves instead of something better because they just, sort of stay in that comfortable position. And when I use the word comfortable, I mean something that they know rather than what's unknown in leaving that job or leaving that relationship. So all of these ways, what it boils down to is it's going to manifest in some way, shape, or form of any of those areas that we've talked about, feeling unfulfilled or just not feeling like the best version of who we could be in this life.
Thank you for sharing that. Aisa, Michelle, any thoughts on that you want to chime in with?
I agree with this as far as like understanding that everybody just like your transition, when you your transition from one thing to another, everybody is different. A lot of times we focus on somebody else's maybe transition being, why was it so positive for them, but it's not positive for myself. So that's why it's important, like she said, go ahead and look at your value. Like, what are you looking for? What is going to fulfill you? Because maybe that transition wasn't as easy for you because it's not what it is actually a good value for you. So I think it's important, like Liz said, as far as the self-care, everybody is different. You know, I can enjoy reading a book and that's my me time. But then there's other people that don't like, you know, to read a book is so anxiety starts building in because they're not understanding what they're reading. So now they're just like so frustrated with the book. Some people go for a run, where for me, going for a run, no, not really. I mean, I'd rather go ahead and actually just hit a punching bag, you know, and that's my me time. Focus on who we are and just like Liz said.
I think that was a very, very important point right there, Aisa, because a lot of times we compare ourselves to others, and we see someone that looks very happy, and maybe they are genuinely like very happy and living life to the fullest, and we want to be like them. So we try to do everything to kind of copy and paste into our life. And I think that is very important, having a very, independent and individual evaluation. One other thing that I wanted to ask Liz was, and it kind of ties into what we were talking about. We keep changing and transforming and, going through different phases in life. So how often should we take a moment to kind of evaluate our self-care practices, and whether or not maybe we're not really, getting as much juice from them, now than, when we started?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point that was just made around all of us being individuals is a really important one here, because I think it's dependent on the person as an individual. Personally, I like to set intentions on my birthday every year. I sort of see that as a second new year. I do, some rituals around the new year, and then I do some rituals around my birthday because that's my personal new year. And that helps me to sort of reassess where I am as a person. Are the things that I wanted last year the same things that I want this year? Where am I in my self-care within those dreams that I have for myself? So those 2 points, I think, of the year are natural starting places if you're new to self-care or me time or whatever you want, a self-stress relief, and you're not quite sure how to evaluate. I think the key message here, though, is wherever you're starting, whether your listeners are resistant to this idea at all because a lot of that guilt is coming up, or they've just never practiced it, so they have no idea where to start. I think it's really important to honor where you are. So honor the fact that this might be the first time that you've ever heard self-care defined in any ways, and these might be new ideas. Honor that, honor the resistance that might even be coming up to it. Assess where you are to begin, get started that way. And I just think naturally each individual will find a rhythm to figure out, whether they sort of need to address other areas of self-care that maybe need their attention. So I feel like that rhythm comes from getting started and then seeing how you're going in certain areas. And I know for myself, when I'm doing better in the physical area versus the mental or emotional area, I can feel, in other words, there's a stuckness in some of those areas, or I have emotions that just keep coming up and I can feel that I'm not processing them because they're starting to direct my behavior in ways that are not productive for my life. So then I know it's time I need to address how I'm taking care of myself emotionally in that moment. So I think in general, a good guide once you get started is how you're feeling. Are you feeling stuck in any of those different categories? What is your intuition telling you, right? We have amazing intuition as women. We have our gut intuition, our heart can tell us things. What is that telling you about which areas need to be addressed and how often? I think as women, we probably need to steer away from the idea of putting a calendar out and saying, every couple of months, I'm going to look into this, because we already have enough of that in our lives, right? Enough of those expectations. So the last thing we want to do with self-care is put some strong expectation that you need to continue to overhaul your self-care regimen X amount of times per year.
If I can ask, so we all have these kind of fantasy ideas of what happiness and joy and living life to the fullest should feel like. So what are some, I guess, notes to reflect on as you're laying, your head on a pillow at night, and to feel good about, the movement happening in your life, and just to feel good about your life and where you are in general? That's an indicator we've talked about as to, when something just doesn't feel right, like we have to listen to our gut instinct and have these conversations with ourselves. But then we also need to be realistic as to what that should feel like?
I think it goes back to one, noticing when you are making progress in your life in different areas. And that's a practice, by the way. All of this is a practice. So when I use that word, what I mean is it's not like you figure out self-care and then you're done. It's sort of the way anyone that practices yoga looks at yoga. You show up for class and you do the best that you can from where you are. We're all at different levels. We all have a different level of strength or flexibility on any given day. So if you commit to doing your best that day from where you are and accepting where you are too, not resisting where you are, I think that's an important part of starting to notice when you're making progress that you may have overlooked in the past. That's definitely been something personally that's been very healing for me as someone who has a lot of perfectionistic tendencies, which I think probably a lot of women listening to this show probably have a lot of those as well. That's a really important part of it. And so it's going to be guided by your individual progress, and it's going to be really guided by your commitment to the practice of, I'm going to show up. I'm going to do the best that I can from where I am. I'm going to wholeheartedly accept where I'm starting from and accept that some days I'll do better with my self-care practices and some days I'll do worse with them. Some days I'll have more down or negative feelings, as we label them in society, and some days I'll have more of the up positive emotions, and that's okay too. I think a lot of what self-care comes down to is just an acceptance, a full acceptance of where we are, of who we are, and of really trying to nurture that self-care relationship with ourselves from wherever we're starting.
Yes, 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 1,000%. Aisa, Michelle, I don't have any other questions or thoughts. Is there anything that either of you wanted to share?
Just say that when you have noticed that you have an awareness that something has to change, and then understanding that accepting that change is not going to be a sign of weakness. Like sometimes we feel like, okay, well, if I'm telling them that I really am having a hard time, understanding something, that's going to be like a sign of weakness. And sometimes we just have to stop and, understand that asking for help or accepting any type of changes is not a sign of weakness. It actually makes you grow, because it takes something that's carrying you and bringing you down to resurface and make you stronger in different areas.
Absolutely. And actually, you bring up a really good point. I think in general, women don't like to ask for help. We like to do it ourselves. As you said earlier, we're used to people relying on us to take care of it for them. So it's harder for us to ask for help. It's not something we're practiced in necessarily. We're just used to sort of carrying the load forward. So that's a practice too. The practice of and you have to be conscious about it. I'm a big believer in intentions. So if your intention is to start to really open up this idea of building a strong relationship with yourself, and some of that might include saying no, as you said earlier, some of that might include asking for help, then you start with baby steps. What's something that I can ask for help on that doesn't feel quite as scary for me? It's like sort of a smaller thing before I dive into the bigger thing. I would encourage any of your listeners or viewers to, if they've never heard of Brene Brown, she is a researcher and a professor, a speaker. She's done so much work on vulnerability. And I think that's really what you're talking about here. It's being open to being vulnerable, which, by the way, creates more intimacy in all of our relationships, including the one with ourselves.
Yeah, I think a lot of this has to do with being self-aware. I think sometimes we all, especially as women, we get into all these different roles. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm whatever, I'm a sister, and whatever I am at work. And we're not really in touch with who are we, outside of all that. We have an identity outside of that. And I know for me, whenever I have a strong reaction to something, I've learned to figure out why I'm so upset about it. And an example, and it may not work this way for everyone, but an example is I'll have my husband and I will do these goal lists every year. When we got married, immediate goals, 3 to 5 year goals, and then 5 year plus type goals. and we did the goals. So he did one and I did one, and then we made a joint one. And then in a year, he's like, okay, let's look at them. And I was mad, like I didn't want to, but I was like, why am I mad? And the reason is because I hadn't made progress on a lot of them. I had, I'd done a lot of things, but I hadn't done what I said what my goals were. I hadn't made like any progress toward some of them, which is surprising, but it's also like embarrassing a little bit. So I think, sometimes when we have a strong reaction to something, if someone's asking us to examine something or ask for help, and we immediately have a really strong internal reaction to that. Sometimes it's because there's something we haven't done. At least in my case, it's always because it's coming from, I know there's something that I should have done that I didn't, or I feel like I should have done more, and I just don't want to look at it. And now what I do is make the goal, but then I put underneath it like what actual things I could accomplish that would be steps towards that goal. And it sounds really silly and simple, but if I can at least look at what what the first step would be just to go in that direction. And then at the end of the year, I can look and see, well, I accomplished some of those things to go towards that goal, then I'll have, less strong reaction about it.
Definitely. And I think if we walk away with anything, from this whole conversation, one thought that just came to mind is there are times when, like I'll pass by a mirror. Like how many times do we actually pass by a mirror, whether it's, in the restroom, in your room, wherever, and you really take a moment to just see yourself, yourself in the mirror. I think and I say that because I've had these moments where I'm like washing my hands and there's a mirror and I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's me. But it feels like you're almost looking at a stranger. Like for me, that just tells me a lot of times we're just running, giving. And we don't stop to see, that reflection of ourselves and what we need. So we have to start there if we haven't already, and we have to give ourselves that time on a regular basis to keep evaluating where we are, because as individuals, we also have dreams of our own that are important. And one day, when we part from this life, we want to feel like we lived every day or as many days as possible with the intention of the best version or continue to progress toward, the best version of ourselves.
Can I say one more thing
Yeah.
before we leave? Liz had mentioned Dr. Brene Brown, and she has 2 really good books that I also do recommend for us as, as mom, as a female, as just basically as an entrepreneur as well too. One of them is Dare to Lead, and the other one is The Gift of Imperfection. The Gift of Imperfection, where she says, we need to let go of who you think you're supposed to be and accept who you are. It's very important, like Liz said, have a little journal, even if it's something small in your purse, and you're eating lunch, write down what's positive, or sometimes even a frustration because we don't know how to express ourselves, but by writing it down and going back and reading it, that's bothering you. How are you going to change that?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Liz. It has been truly a pleasure and a privilege to have you on. Can you share, how can our listeners and our viewers connect with you if they have questions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been I've learned so much from this show. It's been a great opportunity. They can connect with me. I have a website. It's my name, LizDiTomasso.com. That's LizDiTomasso.com. I'm also on Facebook. It's just Liz DiTomasso. And I'm on Instagram at Liz DiTomasso Coaching.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. Michelle or Aisa, did you guys want to share, either one of you, our upcoming event?
So our next meeting is going to be this coming Tuesday. Next Tuesday. I'm way ahead of myself. Tuesday, June 16th, it's going to be via WebEx, 8:30 to 10. And it's going to be about Grant Writing 101. Something important.
Thanks, Aisa. All right. Well, until then, we keep learning, we keep growing, we keep developing, and we keep polishing that best version of ourselves. So thank you much. We'll see you guys.